Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. And I see we have a whole bunch of questions that got saved up from previous times, so maybe I can start with some of these. There's a question here from 0x asking, is it worth moving to the US from UK and Europe to pursue a career in science, mathematics, or engineering if one wants to change the world? Interesting question. I mean, so I moved from the UK to the US in 1978. When I was in the middle of sort of energetically doing physics, I was also pretty young. Particularly at that time, it's like all the new stuff that's happening is happening in the US. And it felt like there was just much more appetite and energy around new things happening in the US than in England, and to some extent also in Europe. I think it's a, if you look kind of empirically at where have most of the kind of science technical innovations come from, mostly they've come from the US, but there are many exceptions. And I would say there's an increasing number of exceptions, and an increasing number of, oh, it was done in, Sweden, France, whatever else. I think when it comes to things like starting companies, expectations around starting companies, there's a somewhat different character to those kinds of things, and there's a somewhat different set of expectations in the US of, I think there's still something of a frontiers type mentality that the kind of people's feeling that, oh yeah, you can go work for a startup and maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't, is a little bit more present in the US than it might be in some countries in Europe, where people are like, oh my God, that's too big a risk. How can you do that? You really need a stable job type thing. But I have to say, I think that sort of the concept of startups even has globalized to the point where it's not, everybody kind of knows what everybody in the relevant sort of space kind of knows what it means to do a startup. It's not like, oh, I've never heard of a startup. Nobody in my country ever did a startup type thing. You'll never find that. You might find a different, and you'll find all kinds of detailed differences, like investors and so on are different in different countries. And the kind of, there'll be a time when the US investors are like, much more aware of companies of a particular kind and prepared to put much higher valuations into those companies. But I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I would have said a few years ago, I would have said the US is much more obviously, oh, that's the place you need to be if you want to get new things to happen. I would say that I see more and more examples of sort of new things that have happened outside the US. I think that in terms of, you ask about science, mathematics, engineering, those tend to start out at universities, and universities are a bit different in different countries and have different expectations. And it sort of depends on what level you're at in universities. Like, for example, one big difference at the college level is in the US, people go to college and they study, they take courses in all kinds of things. In many countries, in Europe, for example, by the time you're in college, you are just studying one subject, and that's all you're doing. Depending on what you want to be doing and what stage you're at, one of those things might be more suitable than the other. I think that, I don't know how else to I think one needs to know more details about the kind of career path to say much more. But I would say that it's, let's put it this way. There is a better understood path for people to do innovative things in the US than there is in other countries. And that has a couple of features. It means if you're just going to follow a path and you want to end up doing something innovative, it's easier to do that in the US than it is in other countries. On the other hand, if the thing you're going to do is so innovative that it's not on a path at all, I think it probably matters somewhat less. And I think one of the things that has happened, which I consider kind of bizarre, is that there was a time when starting a company, being an entrepreneur, was a somewhat unusual kind of thing where you you kind of had to have some initiative to do that. And then it got to the point where there's classes and systems and probably even degrees in being an entrepreneur, so to speak. It became a thing where there's kind of a playbook of this is how to be an entrepreneur. But in a sense, when you're going to do something that involves innovation and initiative, it's not something for which, by the time there's a playbook, it's no longer an innovation initiative type story. If there's a full playbook for how to do it, it's more of a profession, so to speak. And there's sort of, in some sense, there's an attempt, like in Silicon Valley, there has been something of an attempt to make sort of, changing the world a profession, so to speak. I don't think that really works. I think that, if you really want to make change, so to speak, then it's inevitable that it's going to be a unique thing. It's not going to be something for which there's a standardized playbook, so to speak. And what it takes to be in a position to do unique things is a lot of internal stuff, plus not having roadblocks that prevent you doing sort of innovative things. And I suppose if we look at, for example, the university world, that's it's not a it's complicated, because the very success of universities has, in a sense, made it more difficult to do certain kinds of innovation. If your innovation is on a track where it's like, this is a thing that fits right into field X, but I'm going to go better, faster in that direction, then there may be exactly the infrastructure you need at a university or whatever else to move forward with that. If what you're doing is something which is, oh, I'm going to make a new field, I'm going to do something different from what's there, the very fact that the university is big and has all of this kind of, all these tracks that have been built, actually makes it more difficult to do that very innovative thing than it would have been if it was a smaller place. And I think you see that sometimes people say, oh, I want to go to this big place because it's famous and there's all these resources there and so on. That's all well and good. If you fit into one of the tracks at that big place, fantastic. But if you're trying to build something different, that big place is going to fight against you, saying, no, we got all these tracks, just fit in one of those tracks. And you're like, well, I don't want to do that. I want to do something innovative that's different from those tracks. Well, sorry, that doesn't work. And sometimes then it's better to pick a kind of a smaller place, where a less sort of fancy place, where it's like, oh, here's this person coming in and they seem very talented and they're going to do something interesting. And we don't have a sort of an entrenched kind of track that says, oh, if they're going to do something in this vague direction, they've got to be in this particular, department doing this particular thing. And so, and what you see is you see there's a lot in different universities, where some university that's not particularly famous has built some very impressive department and even reputation in some very specific area. And and then perhaps years go by and that area becomes a big thing. Like, I don't know why I'm thinking of Carnegie Mellon, which always used to be a big school for architecture and some arts kinds of things and computer science, when that really wasn't much of a thing. And of course, then, they built that tower, and now computer science is a big, big thing. And now that's, become sort of a top university driven by sort of success in computer science. But I think in some of these places where if you want to do something that's sort of off the track that exists, sometimes the smaller places are a better bet because they have more flexibility in supporting things which aren't, in one of the existing bins. I think the same is true when it comes to companies and things like that. One of the tracks for companies and startups and so on is venture capital, and that that again gets quite tracked. By the time it's a big, back, I don't know, 40 years ago or something now, venture capital was much smaller and much more sort of one-off and much more kind of, oh, there's, let's make this particular deal because it seems interesting type thing. I think now increasingly it's like, well, we're a enterprise software venture capital thing with a whole structure that's built to do that. Or if you have some new and different model, or we don't do that. We don't understand that. We're not built for that. It's a different thing. And if ever you are going to make one of those unusual deals, the only way it's going to get made is by the person at the top who has sort of enough control of things, saying, oh, yeah, I want to do that deal. But often by the time the organization is larger, they don't really want to do that because they've got all these, 100 people under them who are supposed to be figuring out these deals. And it's like, that's their job to figure out the particulars of these deals. But then they're sort of forced to be in these particular tracks because, look, there's this group of 5 people who work on, this particular kind of, bio, IT, whatever type of deal. And if your thing doesn't fit, well, that just doesn't work. Anyway, a few thoughts there. Let's see. Question here from C0, something or other. How long should one wait after college to start some startup in an area of one's interest and expertise? That's a very person-specific question, I think. I mean, there are people who have, a couple of questions. One is, what are you going to do if you're not doing your startup? Are you going to work for somebody else's startup, some other big company? Are you going to go on in school? What are you going to do? I think if you work in another startup, for example, you'll clearly learn a bunch of stuff there. If you work in a big company, depending on the industry, you might or might not learn anything useful. If you go on with education and I would say perish the thought, go to business school, for example, that's probably not a great way to position yourself for doing a startup. Business school is mostly, I know there are efforts to make it other than this, but it's mostly how to be a good cog in a certain type of corporate machine that, and that's, it's a perfectly good profession. There's not but it isn't the same thing as having your own, startup and doing that. I think that's something where, if you've got the passion for it and the energy for it, I would say the trouble is, okay, so you say, if you've got the energy for it and you really want to do it, and you're just, soon after college and so on, there's a certain argument of just go do it. Why? Well, one thing is, as people get older, they tend to end up with, oh, they've got kids and a mortgage and this, that, and the other. And it's like, oh my gosh, I can't quit my job and go and try and do this startup. How will I make the next payment and so on? Whereas people, earlier in life, sometimes don't have those same kinds of things and have more freedom to just say, I'm going to take this crazy risk. And, nobody else is being entwined in taking that risk with me. And so it's easier to do. That's one side of it. The other side of it is people can be sort of too young and naive and, just make too many mistakes. And, typically in doing startups, there's a certain number of mistakes you can make. And there's other ones that, if you make too many, you will kill what you're doing. And so, I think that it's really something of a thing where it depends on sort of what level of kind of business common sense you're at and so on. Now, there are things you can say that sort of might make it a self-answering question. Like you might say, well, will I be able to raise money to do it? If I can't convince anybody to invest money in what I'm doing, then I shouldn't do it. It's a pity if you have to do that. It's great if you can get things started in a bootstrap kind of way where, but it depends. It depends on the level of innovation that you're trying to execute. If you're trying to do something where there's other things where there's a good model and where you can just say, well, I'm doing a different thing, but it's kind of like these other things, then, the can I raise money is not a bad test. Another reasonable test is, can I recruit other people to be part of my thing? Or is it just, I'm talking about this stuff, but nobody else gets what I'm talking about and I can't recruit them? Those are kind of good tests, I would say, of whether it's time, so to speak, to do a startup. But I would say that it really is very person-dependent thing. I mean, I know people who've done startups at very early stage. You know, they didn't finish college, they did their startup. I know people who've gone through and had very kind of sort of well-tracked corporate jobs, and then at some moment they kind of say, "Oh, but I've got this thing. I really know how to do this thing really well for this industry. I really want to do it myself," and they manage to get that startup going. I've also seen cases that are a little bit, sometimes I said this to people, they've worked for some big company for years, and then they say, "But now I'm going to do a startup." And it's like, do you really know what that means? I mean, it's kind of like you have to lick the stamps yourself type thing. And, you're used to an organization where there are 8 levels of approvals and all the structure and the stamp licking is done somewhere, very, very, very far distant from where you're actually working. And they start these startups and they're like, "Oh, but we need to delegate this to this and this and this." Well, you don't have anybody to delegate it to. It's just a startup. You've got 1 person or 3 people or 5 people or something, and it's just very disorienting and doesn't work out well. But a few thoughts there. Okay, RR is asking, when you're thinking deeply about a problem, do you think on paper or on a computer or a tablet? Which do I find is better than the others? For me, I'm I kind of think in the language that I've spent the last 40 years building, Wolfram language. This is my kind of way of taking thoughts that I have and trying to really sort of work them out. And so a lot of work that I do is just, typing in a, notebook, code, writing things, and I'll write, words around the code, so to speak, to explain to myself what I'm doing. I would say that's sort of a core part is reducing to computational form things that I'm thinking about, because that for me is the way of sort of structuring my thoughts. Is, can I turn these vague thoughts into something computational? That's one piece. Another thing is kind of writing things, writing descriptions, expositions of things. That's a great way for me to understand what I'm talking about and to really work things out. And sometimes I'm kind of a little bit sort of a funny feeling, because I'll realize I've written some exposition of something and I just wrote it. I'm thinking about it, I'm writing it, I'm thinking about it, I'm writing it. And then I come back to it a few weeks later and it's like, oh, that was actually pretty good. I figured out a lot of stuff. I'd forgotten a bunch of the things that I figured out as I was writing that exposition. Lucky that I wrote it down, because now I at least have those thoughts put down somewhere. And I think the other thing for me is explaining things like these live streams are great for me, because I get to actually work out some thoughts that I have sometimes, they get worked out much better through the effort of trying to explain them. And in my other kind of day job life, so to speak, of running a company, a lot of the thing that is useful for me in working things out is interacting with people, talking about those kinds of ideas. And usually what I'll be doing is, often, it depends on the nature of the thing. If it's something where I'm trying to create something, I'll have some notebook open and I'll be typing things in and I'll be talking to other people and try and sort of make progress that way. And that's what causes me to think about things. And very often in those kinds of meetings, it's like when I'm kind of challenged to explain something, that's the moment where I actually figure it out, where I actually figure out what I'm trying to say. And I've kind of gotten to the point where, well, like there's a problem I'm trying to figure out right now, which I really need to explain to some more people, because I know that's the way that I'm actually going to figure it out, is kind of that effort of just, what's the point? Okay, I'm going to try to explain in a few sentences, what's the point? And that getting to figure out what's the point, that's the place where I really understand what's going on. I mean, I'm a person who tends to like to understand things in a fairly foundational type of way, of really drilling down sort of what is the underlying point? What is the foundational point? Other people are much more able than I am, for example, to sort of float in the clouds and get from here to there without really understanding at a bedrock level what's going on. For me, when I make progress, it's because I do understand things at sort of a more bedrock level. I really understand what is the overall point, what is the sort of, if it's a business thing, what's kind of the overall strategic thematic point. Same kind of thing with science, rather than there's this technical thing I can get from this one technical thing to this other technical thing. Different people work differently, but and at least for my way of doing it, it's these moments of kind of clarity of what is the real point, what is the way to think about this problem, what is the thing that is the right orientation for thinking about this issue. That's what really helps me to make forward progress. Now, I will say that sometimes my use of paper has not gone to zero. I mean, I usually have, there are just some kinds of things where I'm like sketching absolutely meaningless sketches at some level, where I'm just sort of, it helps me sometimes with some kinds of conceptual things. It helps me. I would say this is a once every few weeks, one piece of paper usage, so to speak. And because I'm a crazy personal analytics archiving kind of guy, I know I have lots of bankers boxes full of pieces of paper that I scribbled things on, 30 years ago or something now. And I can say that my rate of doing this has dramatically decreased to the point where it probably is only one sheet of paper every couple of weeks of sort of sketched stuff. And it's usually what that is usually kind of, I'm trying to organize a thought about how things fit together somehow. And for that, it's kind of useful to be able to just sketch something on a piece of paper in a way that isn't quite as linear as what I would do in a notebook, kind of thinking things through computationally. I'm not at the stage yet where I can try and sort of represent something computationally. Let's see. There's a question here from Aaron about, can you tell a couple of stamp-licking stories from the early days of starting Mathematica and Wolfram Research? Oh, you don't have to go to early days. You could go to my meetings today. I mean, what happens is, here's what happens in companies. You have a company and you're running the thing and you hire people to do all these different functions that need to be done. If the company is doing new things, there will always be functions where there's nobody in place to do that function. And so those are the things that reverse delegate up to the CEO, basically, if they're going to get done at all. And that's, and that's also one of the challenges in kind of innovating in a company is you're always, to make an efficient company, you have to have well-structured groups. You have to have sort of well-structured management hierarchy and things like this. On the other hand, that specifically denies the possibility of having this new piece that you didn't already think of. And so, for example, right now with our company, there's a bunch of new stuff I want to do. And I've realized that we need to sort of rejigger things a bit. And so, for example, for me, one of the things that's important is, okay, there's going to be a new department. What's its name going to be? It sounds kind of trivial, but it's not as trivial as you think, because that name, if you get it wrong, and we've done that plenty of times, people from the other parts of the company say, oh yeah, but that's the such and such department. We know what they do this. And we'll give them this to do, we won't give them that to do, we won't communicate with them about this. If the name is wrong, they get very confused. And sometimes then there might be an expectation from another part of the company, oh, those guys will take care of it in the such and such department, because the name of their department is such that of course they'll take care of those kinds of things. Now, the other problem is when you have departments whose names are just completely meaningless. There's one, I remember its acronym in our system, but I don't remember what its actual name is. But it's a group, it's a very useful group, but it's a, oh my gosh, what is it called? Well, anyway, its acronym is QSIS, and it is a group which, among other things, deals with the triage of feedback that we get from Wolfram Alpha. And it's not tech support, because it's not providing support to users. It's not kind of quality assurance, because although it generates bug reports, it's not specifically doing that. And it's it's an example of a group where one day I realized we need years ago now, we need this function. There's a definite set of functions here. We need it. As you can tell, that's not a success story in terms of the naming of the group, because I can't even remember what the name of the group is. But for me, that's it's part of like understand what is the thematic point. What is this group we're trying to make? What is this thing that we're trying to define that we want people to sort of rally around doing? And so that for me is one of the starting points. And when you don't have that named group, when it's all sort of amorphous, that's the place where it gets reverse delegated to the CEO, basically. Now, I mean, in terms of I think in terms of the early days of our company, there are many things, but I mean, whether it's who gets to put the floppy disks in the boxes and shrink wrap the boxes, who gets to write that piece of copy that has to go in some catalog for some software vendor back when there were such things, back 35 years ago or something now. All of these things were just remarkable how much interstitial stuff there is to do. And until you get things well defined and you know what you're doing and you build a group that just does that, and then that's fine until you want to do something new, and then you have to go back again to do that other stuff. And for example, at many times in the history of our company, we've had a special projects group, which usually reports directly to me, and which is dealing with the kind of none of the above type stuff, and is something where we try to, while it's a lot of, we don't really know what to do, and so it ends up coming to me of what should we actually do. It's still got some structure there for some sort of, feet on the ground, so to speak, to make some things happen, even though they're quite diverse in what needs to be done. Let's see. Satoshi, good name there, is asking, what are your thoughts on crypto and blockchain from a business perspective and in general? We have an operation called Wolfram Blockchain Labs, which has been energetically doing all kinds of things. We have sort of some unique things to offer in terms of the technical side of blockchain, both in terms of blockchain analytics, in terms of access to sort of technical communities that have been using our technology stack for a long time, in terms of sort of our unique ability to deliver kind of computational facts based on the whole Wolfram Alpha story, and on a bunch of things we've done with Wolfram language relating to computational contracts. Many of those things, some of those things are very here and now type things. Some of them are quite future oriented, like the idea of computational contracts. But if you ask what my general view of the whole sort of blockchain world is, I think the interesting thing about it, as far as I'm concerned, is this. It's an excuse to redo a lot of infrastructure. It's like when cloud computing came in, SaaS, software as a service type stuff came in. Yeah, everybody had software that did this or that. But when you say, oh, we're going to make it a cloud service, in the end, the core of that thing might be the same as what you always had, but it's somehow refactored and rethought because it's now operating in the cloud. And we saw the same thing with personal computers, with workstations. Every one of these kind of delivery platform innovations has caused a rethinking of sort of how one builds that stack of technology. And I think blockchain is the same way. And whether, in the end, you might not even need the blockchain, so to speak, but it's an excuse to kind of rethink how certain kinds of infrastructure systems work in the world. And I think that's pretty interesting, whether that's, governance type systems or ledgering distributed database type systems and so on. The actual technology, well, there are all kinds of things that aren't that fantastic about the actual technology. And there's also this overlay, which is a very different overlay of kind of the large amounts of money which have come into that business largely through speculation. And that's a very bizarre thing, because a lot of businesses, you see money come in through speculation, but it's much more structured. As in, somebody says, oh, VR, AR is amazing. The metaverse is going to take over everything. And lots of speculative money goes in there, but it's institutional speculative money mostly. It's mostly it's investment firms and things like this putting money in, or companies and so on. But in the blockchain world, the thing that was very different was the fact that it was such a broad kind of collection of people that were, it's kind of like that were sort of crowdsourced venture capital type thing that came into that world, and that the amounts were really very huge, and that's an interesting and unusual dynamic. I don't think I've ever seen that before. You see industries where, to my mind, sort of outsized amounts of money go into them, but it's usually institutional money, and it usually has more kind of governance strings attached to it than in the case of the blockchain worlds. So, that's been a strange thing. And I think one thing that's really interesting about the blockchain world is the diversity in every possible, dimension of people involved in the blockchain business. I mean, as we've seen different kinds of areas where people get enthusiastic, whether it's machine learning or quantum computing or social media or whatever else. Many of these things have there's a certain type of background of person. If you're going to be a quantum computing enthusiast, it's probably a good idea if you know some physics and some mathematics and so on. Otherwise, there really isn't a lot you can do there. I mean, we can talk about whether the end result there is going to pan out the way some people think, but that's a different story. I mean, I think my expectation, just to fill it in, people might have heard it from me before, but the formalism of quantum mechanics is very interesting, and there are lots of great things that can be done with it. I think we're managing to do some rather interesting things with our physics project in that area and so on. Meanwhile, the kind of make computers out of things other than semiconductors and silicon and electrons and so on, that's also worthwhile. But and we're going to have this amazing flag that we can wave that says quantum brand, and it's going to be amazing. I don't think that's reality. But that doesn't mean that those two ends aren't perfectly worthwhile. But in any case, so as I was saying, the thing that's interesting about these different areas that become very popular is that in some of these areas, it's kind of like you have to have a certain background to be a player in that area. And what's interesting about blockchain is how diverse those backgrounds can be and still be something where you have something potentially to contribute, whether it's the highly intellectualized, whether it's the very scrappy business area, whether it's the very, somebody who knows about some very specific, unexpected industry, whether it's the person in some strange part of the world where there's, a sort of easier story interacting with the government, whatever else it is. It's just been one of the things that's interesting about it is it's this melting pot of different kinds of skills and backgrounds and so on, which I think makes it rather interesting, and that I think has definitely added energy to that world. But I think the big thing, at this point, the good news is there are some pretty big war chests that have been developed there in terms of money to get things to happen. The other thing that's happened there is often those war chests were gotten by people who were like, oh my gosh, we're managing to raise $1 billion here. We only expected to raise $10 million, and we're kind of inexperienced and don't really know what to do with this. But again, a difference from a lot of these other industries where by the time the amounts of money are very large, it's people who have had lots of experience in dealing with those kinds of things. And so that adds energy to the blockchain world. It also adds a little bit of insanity to the blockchain world. When there's sort of a large leverage with sort of low experience, so to speak. It's a strange situation. Let's see. Al is asking, what have been some of the most interesting and hard questions you've been asked here and elsewhere? Oh my gosh. I don't know. trying to think what questions people have asked that have caused me, you know, I have a, you know, as people who watch these live streams might or might not agree with me about, I think I have a decently good memory, but my memory has certain kinds of things that it's pretty good at, and certain kinds of things I'm not so good at. So, for example, I'm pretty good at remembering facts. I'm pretty good at remembering sort of things that happen. If you ask me to place those things that happen in, you know, a time order, or tell me, you know, where did you learn that? Sometimes, where did I learn that fact? I probably know, but I have a very hard time kind of sort of, you know, if you say, it's funny because you know, again, with sometimes with people as well, there'll be things that I'll have learned from a person. I'll know all kinds of things about a person, and somebody will say, "What does that person look like?" I say, "I don't really remember. You know, I remember the thing I learned from them, but I won't. You know, and I might remember their name too, but it's kind of like I'm not really. There's a certain, you know, one of my deficiencies. Let's see. Tori is asking, can ChatGPT increase productivity? Is outsourcing writing skills beneficial or damaging? You know, look, this technology is very cute, very cool, and it's, you know, by the time what we're doing is sending, you know, machine-written sort of gunk back and forth, I think it's kind of not a good situation, so to speak. I mean, I would say that the thing that I am, you know, if it's like, oh, you've got to write kind of a piece of copy that fills in the slot, you've got to write a review that goes on this website, you've got to generate some kind of you know, let's generate 1,000 reviews of this product or something, then sure, you can use these kind of you know, chat AI based systems. I don't think that, you know, the typical expositions that I try to write, or that one tries to write, that really crisply explain things to people, that's not going away anytime soon. That's not about to get automated away. I would say that one of the things about automation is that, in a sense, there's things that technology allows one to do that nobody's ever been able to do before. And there are things where one says, humans shouldn't have been doing that in the first place. And whether that's, you know, figuring out how to add up columns of numbers, or whether that's doing something where they were, you know, and those are things which are sort of low-hanging fruit for automation. I just don't think that the, you know, crisp exposition of what the point is really, that's not a ripe for automation kind of thing. So I'm not expecting that I will anytime soon have the things that I try to write be able to be something that I can automate. I mean, you know, I've spent a lot of my life trying to automate the process of having a good language in which we humans can communicate with computers to then get the leverage of what computers do well. But the point there is, we humans get to do the thing we do well, which is decide what we care about doing, so to speak, and defining what we think the point is, and then the legwork gets delegated to the computer. I think that most kinds of I mean, okay, maybe I'm spoiled here because I'm a pretty fast writer. Once I know what I want to write, I can get the words down on paper pretty easily. On computer, really pretty easily. Maybe there's a place where people would like to be able to say, well, I can explain myself verbally. I'm talking about this, this, and this, but I have a terrible writer's block and I can't put the words, and I'm going to get some AI to help me put the words down. Maybe that will work. I have to say, I think you'd be better off with a transcription program which can capture the words you're saying, and that's your way of explaining what you're talking about to your fellow human, because that is, after all, what the typical exercise in writing is about, is explain to your fellow human what you're talking about, so to speak. Prab is saying the AI did my homework is the inverse of the dog ate my homework. Right. I mean, I think, with Wolfram Alpha over the last, what is it now, 12, 13 years now, there's a lot of times when people could say, well, the AI did my homework type thing. I just sort of gave it to Wolfram Alpha. I think by the time the exercise that is being given to the human is one where you can just slam dunk, that's all there is what the computer was able to do for you. That's kind of the wrong exercise, so to speak. Then you're teaching a human to do what a computer can do better, so to speak. And I think that's, and indeed, I think there are lots of things where people get to teach the humans the things which are sort of at a higher level because there is legwork being done by the AIs. Let's see. Yeah, Logseq saying visual AI can produce amazing inspirations for jewelry and that sort of intricate art. I agree. The thing that is a very interesting feature of sort of AI generated creative stuff. We discovered that back in 2007. We have a website called Wolfram Tones, which is a music generation website that in modern times you would call it an AI music generation website. I like to think of it as kind of plucking music from the computational universe of possible programs. And I had thought, well, what's the role of computers in creating music, for example? I had thought, well, maybe the computers are good at dressing things up, kind of what I was saying about text. They're good at dressing things up, but they're not going to be the place where the creative spark comes from. I was quite wrong about that. What I heard people say many, many, many times is Wolfram Tones is a good place to get an idea, a germ of an idea about that you can develop as a human. And I suppose that's, maybe I should, and I agree that in the case of probably musical things, visual things, yes, there are germs of good ideas that come from those places. And in a sense, it's kind of like, you do photography. Photography is about capturing those things in the world that you think are interesting. And I think that what we were able to do with Wolfram Tones, for example, was do a certain amount of filtering automatically to say, these are things that humans are likely to find interesting. And I agree that there are perfectly good in the visual arts area. I agree that there are things where I think it will be the case that there are things where you're trying to get at some level. I think what it perhaps is that to some extent, music, visual art, and so on, they are a little bit more sort of communicating with the lower level parts of our sort of cognitive stack of, there's an emotional reaction that you're going to have to this. There's a, something like that. And that's in a sense a thing that is more readily accessible, I think, maybe. We can produce a picture that gives us a certain kind of impression and feeling and so on. When you have a piece of text, there is certainly a texture of the text that might give that, but you actually have human language is a rich thing for actually communicating content. And I think that's something where it's more difficult. Now in the case of art, visual art, for example, if you said, I want this visual art to give me a sense of warm and fuzzy and this, that, and the other, but it has to be related to, space and the exploration of I don't know what, something like this, then I can imagine something which does a pretty good job at giving the human the sort of feeling of that. But if you say, I want to produce a piece of visual arts that's the instruction manual for a spacecraft I'm going to fly in, it's not going to work, because that's a thing that is too detailed, too engaged with kind of higher cognitive functions. It's not something where you can just sort of pick the pieces from somewhere, put it together and get the right feeling. But there are places where it's very valuable to pick the pieces and get the right feeling. And I'm sure, I don't think we've seen kind of by any means, even really the beginning of what's possible from kind of computer generated feeling generators, so to speak. I thought, when we first built our Wolfram Tones website and so on, we originally built it because I wanted a unique cell phone ringtone, and kind of a rather silly thing, but I was sort of fed up with having a cell phone ringtone where I was looking around, who else in this restaurant or whatever, whose phone is ringing? It's my phone ringing type thing. And it's like, give me something unique. And that was a time when there was just starting to be sort of enthusiasm for, I think there was the Crazy Frog ringtone and things like this. And I thought, let's have a mass customized ringtone mechanism where you can just generate, you can just press a button and generate another ringtone that will be reasonable in some particular genre. And so that's what we did in 2007. And I thought that was, this concept of mass customization of artistic objects was going to be an interesting thing. And I have to say, I haven't thought about it that much since then. And I suppose now there's a lot more capability to produce some of those kinds of things. I mean, I've thought about it in terms of, we had some NFTs last year that were made from cellular automata, always a great source of sort of pluck from the computational universe and get something which is aesthetically interesting. I mean, the sort of the fundamental thing that's going on there is cellular automata are simple programs which can do very complicated things. The natural world is full of simple programs that do very complicated things. And many of the things that we're most excited about and consider most engaging in the natural world, whether they're forms of, plants or whatever else it is, those are things that come just like these cellular automata from simple rules that do complicated things. So we're, in a sense, as we sort of sample things from the computational universe, we're picking the essence of the thing that makes engaging, rich content in nature. And we humans are very much adapted to noticing things in nature. And so this is the same sort of essence. And that's why we're picking up on these kinds of things. And when the things we generate are sufficiently alien that they're nothing like anything we've seen before, we usually don't react very much to them. And, I think that's in a sense, it's sort of sometimes a story in various kind of movements in art. Oh, this is a thing like you've never seen before. And many people just say, I don't get it. I don't understand what that is. And then somebody else will say, but we're going to extend human culture in that direction, and then you will understand it. Then it will have a context and you'll understand it. And yes, but it may take a while. But I think the thing that is sort of an interesting question is mass customization of art. Where is it going to be most useful? What's going to be the sort of the important app? I mean, clearly, when you have cell phones and you've got a bunch of people in one room and they all got to have unique ringtones, that's a place where there's a little bit of use case for mass customization. It's like I don't know whether it's not like there are enough kind of clothes manufacturers and things like that the it's not like the mass customization of that is so obviously important. Plus, there are a lot of constraints often on, well, if you do that, that's a really goofy place to put the pattern on, on a shirt or something like this. So that's not really going to work. And it's there are complicated constraints and which are not so easy to capture there. But I think it's an interesting challenge and question where sort of mass customization of artistic things is going to be most valuable. Let's see. The question here, right? Sometimes they're easy questions, or so I think. From Schrodinger here, do you drink caffeine sources like tea or coffee? How many per day? No, I don't. I never drink coffee or tea. I do eat quite a lot of chocolate, and which has theobromine, the precursor of caffeine. So I don't know. I don't know whether I get my caffeine equivalent fix by eating. I sort of have this strange mixture of dark and light chocolate. I think depending on mood and depending on other things and time of day a bit, I'll pick which of those to have. I always found that I've always taken the point of view that these kind of stimulatory things like coffee and so on, that maybe if I'm really if I'm really my energy decays one day, then it's time to pump it up like that. But I don't really need that right now. Plus, well, okay, to tell a silly story against myself, long ago when I was in my 20s, I remember I one time I had some Mountain Dew, which is a very caffeinated thing, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm getting heart arrhythmia. I'm about to, have a heart attack or something, and I fortunately was able to ask some doctor friend of mine what was going on. And they was like, you just drank a bunch of Mountain Dew. That's that's what happens if you are not used to doing that, and and basically inject lots of caffeine into yourself. That's what's going to happen. So I haven't done that since. Let's see. Ark is asking, what practices do you use to gauge and cultivate meaningful accountability as an individual and as part of a collective? Well, I don't think in most kinds of projects that a pure collective really works, I will claim. I think most things that get done need leadership. I just don't think let's all just kind of pitch in and it'll all get worked out somehow. I don't think that usually works. And part of the reason is because people say, well, I'm going to do the part that I can do well. Well, okay, there are 5 people who say that, but turns out there are 2 extra parts that need to be done, and nobody just signed up to do them. So how do they get done? And in the end, that's a lot of, in running companies and things, that's a lot of what one ends up finding one does. There are people doing these pieces, and then you have to say, well, there's this whole, I talked before about kind of the reverse delegation to the CEO, but there's also there are these groups that are close to that hole. Can you push them together to actually get them to fill in that hole between them? And I think that's a common thing in projects, that if it's a pure kind of, well, let's collectively do this project, I think it's a tough thing to make work. I mean, maybe I'm just, I've spent more than half my life CEOing my company. And so maybe I'm just, too dyed-in-the-wool CEO type thing. But that's my impression, at least. And I think in terms of how do you generate accountability of people in a team? That's a role of good management, is to make sure people know you're responsible for this piece. We all care about this piece. You've got to deliver that piece, and to give visibility to the people who are delivering the pieces about how that fits into the whole. And sometimes I think that's challenging. And I know, I like a company I happen to be doing twice a year company meeting in a couple of days. And one of the things that I will talk about and I consider important is, people who are working away in some corner of something, do they understand what the big picture is? And, you might say, well, why do you need to know what the big picture is? And to some extent, you don't, okay, there's a certain level of big picture that is really, I always think it's better for people to know the bigger picture. On the other hand, you don't want people saying, well, my piece here, which somebody told me fits into the big picture this way, I'm not going to do that piece because I figured out the big picture better than everybody else has, and I know my piece, should be done differently. That's usually ends badly, because with luck, you have people in place who are figuring out the big picture well, and who have more visibility about what the different pieces, what the different things that contribute to that big picture are. And the person who's off doing this piece over here, they probably don't have such visibility. But the more they know about what the big picture is supposed to be, then around the edges of the piece they're doing, they know, oh, well, there's this one thing, for example, common thing. They're doing a piece. And it turns out one piece of the piece is really hard. And they could say, I was told to do this piece. I'm just going to keep beavering away to do this thing, even though it's really hard, even though it's going to take me 2 months to do this, I'm going to keep on trying to do it. But in fact, if they knew the bigger picture, they would realize, well, actually, that was the suggestion, is go try and do this piece. But actually, it turns out that piece is not, it isn't really critical to the big picture. You could zoom out and realize that piece wasn't something that needed to be done. It's something that if the person who's doing their piece knows enough about the big picture, they can realize that part of what they were doing should be changed a bit, or at least they can ask somebody, hey, wait a minute, does this really fit into the big picture? Should I be doing something different? But so it's a bit of a complicated thing, but I tend to think that the more people understand about the big picture, so long as they're responsible about it. You don't want the junior person who's working on this small piece here keeping on saying, I'm not going to do that piece because I have this theory about the big picture where I'm totally naive about it, but I have this theory that says my piece should be done differently. That's a huge time waste, and doesn't usually end well. But I think the I'm beavering away on this thing and I have no idea how it fits into the whole strategy and theme and so on. That's also bad. And I think that by having more knowledge about sort of how things fit in, that generates more accountability of, so I know why I'm doing this. So I know why, if I don't produce this, why the whole creature is going to collapse. Let's see. Aaron is asking, what was your revenue plan and time to revenue when starting my company? Well, my Wolfram Research that's 36 years ago now. So the world was different. Lots of things were different, but when we built the first version of Mathematica, I kind of had I sort of hoped we get it done in about a year, but it was about 18 months in the end. And I was lucky enough, I didn't have any, get any investment money, but I was lucky enough to be able to make deals with companies that wanted to buy for resale the software that we were building. And so I was able to get revenue really quite early as sort of an advance against the thing that we were building. And I kind of needed to have, have had something of a track record and have some sort of very clear picture of these are the things we're building and here's the pieces of what's going to be done, so to speak. So I had a very short-term view of generating revenue. I think, it's complicated because it depends on what you're trying to do, and it depends on sort of, there are companies where they've, gotten in $100 million of investment money and they have no idea what their source of revenue is going to be, but it's like, well, this seems like a good thing to build. Let's go ahead and build it. And they go down the roller coaster with their $100 million, and turns out they figure out something to really get revenue, and they come up the other side of the roller coaster and everything's golden. There are also cases where that happens and they don't make it to the other side of the roller coaster. And it's just like, well, they burnt the money, and I would say that happens, more often in the case where the thing they were building wasn't really very sensible to begin with, but it's still, I think it depends what kind of business you're in. There are businesses where you're building, a fusion reactor or something, and the time to revenue for a fusion reactor is going to be very long. If it, hopefully it'll be finite, but it's certainly going to be long. But it's whereas if you're building some piece of, simple utility software or something like this, and you have a great idea, and it's like, oh, I can build this neat little thing, it should be the case that the time to revenue is much shorter. So I think it really depends on the type of company, and it depends on, and really in a sense, part of what you're asking is how much should you be prepared to sort of invest either yourself of your time or maybe even your money as well, versus, and then, before it's going to work. And I would say that spending more time yourself building something, I've seen that work out pretty well a lot of times. By the time you're taking somebody else's money, you've lit a fuse. That other entity whose money you've taken, they have some investment pattern, some return on investment kind of time frame, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you better fit in that time frame or everybody's going to be unhappy. And so at that point, you kind of have, that fuse has been lit, the thing's going to blow up in a certain amount of time. You better be able to get to revenue in that period of time, or convince the next investor to pick you up. But that's a very, that becomes a very dangerous game, because you end up with something where it's like you keep on saying, well, we're going to get to it. We're going to get to it. We're going to, get to revenue. We're going to get to something that has tangible value. and you're getting more and more investors, and they're perhaps getting more and more skeptical, and you get to the point where it's like, oh my gosh, we've got this big entity that's running, and we've got all these investors. If we can't close this next investment round, the whole thing's going to, fly apart. And then you end up, that's when you end up bringing in the investor you really shouldn't have brought in, or ending up with some deal that is eventually going to cause you a huge amount of trouble. And I've seen that way too many times of something where people get to the point where they're relying on they're treating investment money like revenue. With revenue, if you make something useful for customers, there'll be more customers, there'll be the same customers coming back to renew things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a thing that has a continuing, has continuing legs to it. But with investment, it's like you get investment, you burn the investment, and then you have to get more investment, burn that investment. And it's something very different from actually having revenue. But I've seen people who seem to treat investment like revenue, of like, oh, we'll just go and get more investment, we'll get more investment. And there are certainly well-publicized examples of companies that have been very successful where that has more or less worked for long periods of time. But that's the exceptional case. The more common case is it gets harder and harder to get that investment money, and eventually you go and get investment money, which causes you just unbelievable trouble for one reason or another, whether it's some contract which requires you to do this or that, whether it's some just difficult investor, or whether it's a valuation that's really bad, or whether it's all kinds of different things. But you've taken it in a panic, so to speak, and it was the wrong thing. Let's see. Okay, Paolo is asking that I've talked before about using a hierarchical knowledge organization of things in folders. And Paolo is asking, do you ever try using a network knowledge organization system, e.g., and now there are things I've not heard of, Logseq, Wolfram Research, Mem.ai. People show me these things, and at times, particularly young people, have shown me a bunch of these. Oh, look, it's so cool. You can organize these things and have this piece connects to that piece, connects to that piece. I have to say, I don't find that, I've not been able to untangle that for myself. Now, I have to tell you a story. There were theories in the AI world in the 1970s, 1980s about it's all about connections, and it's all about how knowledge is connected. Like a company I did a bunch of work for in the early 80s called Thinking Machines Corporation had this computer called the connection machine computer that was originally came out of AI thinking about knowledge organization and so on. In the end, it wasn't very much of an AI play as a computer. That's a completely different story. But my point is that there's been a long history of knowledge is to be arranged in this networky type way. And the same thing is true with various kinds of knowledge graph type ways of representing things. I have to say, I'm not a big fan of this stuff. It's not what we use in Wolfram Alpha, for example. It's not how we organize it's not, there's knowledge about an area, let's say astronomy, where are the planets, things like that. It's not really relational knowledge. It's not, oh, this planet is inside the orbit of that planet type thing. It's more just, well, what's actually true? There's this idea that knowledge is all about relations. I don't really think that's right. And I think that when it comes to, okay, so to riff a little bit on this question about organizing knowledge for one's own use, there are certainly cases, and I don't have a great system for this, maybe I need to invent one, where I've got a folder about something, and I realize I really want this to point to some other folder. Now, most of the time, these folders are orthogonalized enough that isn't an important thing. But I have to say, I will admit that at times I'll take some document or something and I'll literally copy it into 2 different folders, because I know that at the time when I get interested in this topic, I'm going to care about that document. And it also would be true if I got interested in this other topic over here. And that's a kind of a lousy thing. But on the other hand, I don't do it very often. So it's not like that's a burning problem where I really need all these connections to happen. So I haven't myself, I have not found these things all that useful, although, as I say, I've certainly heard particularly young people enthusing about them. And I suppose it might be one of these things where yeah, I mean, look, I will say that in terms of organizational knowledge, I mean, there was a time when people were saying, oh, you know, take something like Wikipedia and it's all about MathWorld or one of these other kind of information source kinds of websites. And it's all about the connections. It's all about the network of how things are connected. And even at like our summer school and things, people have done projects about things like Wikipedia and so on, and its connectivity structure. And nothing's ever much come out of that. And, you know, it's kind of like you might think, oh, you can understand the map of how this particular area works by seeing all these different connections between different parts of that area, and you can understand the prerequisites. If I'm trying to learn, you know, algebraic K-theory, here's what I have to learn in mathematics to get there, or whatever else. I've never really seen that work well. I will say that, you know, there was sort of an area in bibliometrics where people were like, let's make a map of a particular field of science, for example. You know, there are all these papers out there. There's 10,000 papers in this field of science. Let's make a map of how they're all connected, and we'll learn something about how to sort of think about that field based on that connectivity data. You know, I've done this myself, actually, for things in mathematics, where we have all these theorems. There are like 3 or 4 million theorems that have been proved in the literature of mathematics, and maybe about a few 100,000 of them have been decently well curated. And it's like you can make these graphs that show the connections between these different areas of mathematics that are implicit in kind of what theorem connects to what other theorem. And I have to say that in terms of sort of understanding mathematics, I'm not sure that's helped me very much. And in terms of knowing kind of, oh, I'm here, I mean, I suppose at some level, the web is a great big example of sort of the hypertext linking from here to there, and the value of having sort of these links from here to there. But I would say that those links are, yeah, so a question you might ask is, if I'm kind of building my filing system, should I be building it as a bunch of hyperlinked web pages, or should I be building it as just a linear kind of you know, thing with a bunch of hierarchical files and so on? Again, I will point out that while the concept of links on the web has been very powerful, I would say that things like HyperCard and Xanadu, the predecessor of the web, I would say that the linking aspects of these and the, oh, we'll just jump into that place, have not been so successful. Same thing is true with, you know, the hypertext novel or the hypertext textbook, where, you know, and I think the reason is this. I think when you write a book, let's say, there's a definite, you can keep in mind, we poor humans can only keep a certain amount in our minds. You can keep in mind, there's this kind of, I'm going to write chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. I've got some idea what people's experience is going to be going through these chapters and kind of the linear sequence of what they're going to get out of it. Now somebody says, okay, I want you to write a hypertext textbook where people can navigate through it in all these different ways, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's much harder for the poor human author to grasp what's going to happen. I mean, in a sense, you know, language design for our computational language is a story of trying to do a version of that, because we have all these functions that do all these different things. And what one is trying to do in language design is not just to say, hey, here's this one piece of narrative we're writing, but here are these pieces, and you can connect them together however you want. However they fit, you can connect them together. I mean, I suppose that's the limitingly granular case of kind of trying to write the ultimate sort of hypertext novel or something is computational language design, where the primitives, you know, it isn't the whole scene of how the you know, the dragon landed in the town or something. It's rather this particular function, and that you get to fit together with other functions in a very granular way. But so I kind of think that as a way to organize things that you're going to remember, Yeah, I mean, I suppose that the thing I would say is it's hard enough to organize things in this sort of linear fashion. By the time you are effectively doing language design, which I consider to be, if I'm to rank the kind of intellectual difficulty of things I've ever tried to do, I mean, language design is probably the number one in terms of, it beats out most of science and things like this as a intellectually challenging, really requires real intellectual tenacity to drill down and figure out, how should this really work? I mean, it kind of, for me, it's a little bit hard to recognize, because I've been doing language design now for more than 40 years. And so for me, there's a lot of stuff there that's pretty reflexive at this point. And so it sort of feels a bit easier to me than I think it in some sense really is. But it's a really intellectually challenging thing. And if you say to me, in your filing system, I want you to do the equivalent of language design, we have these modular pieces that fit arbitrarily together, that's a big ask. And I think it's not something, in a sense, you're not going to spend all your time doing, your filing system is something you can spend a certain amount of time creating, but that can't be your focus. It's kind of like it reminds me of kind of the operating system where it happened years ago, an operating system that had a scheduler that was scheduling which programs to run. And eventually the scheduler was taking 90% of the time of the operating system. And it's like, well, you're spending 90% of your time figuring out what you're going to do. And that's sort of the wrong calculation. And so it is with, I think, with filing and so on. You've got to do something which is robust, takes a reasonably short amount of time. And, because a lot of times you'll be putting something in a file and you may never look at it again. And so then don't spend too much time figuring out exactly what file to put it in. All right, maybe a couple more things here. Tori is commenting that our Wolfram language documentation is amazing because it is so connected with related functions and so on. Yes, we get a lot of stuff at there. Here's an interesting thing about that. Surprised me. So, we'll have some function, and then we'll have a see also, which says see also other functions that are relevant to, that are related to this. Okay, so I've often been writing these see alsos, been doing them with other people and so on. You have a bunch of people who know about these functions, and you might think, oh, everybody's going to be arguing about what's the order of functions in the see also, what should really be there and so on. It is remarkably robustly determinable. I mean, in other words, it's like, this is the most relevant, this is the second most relevant, third most relevant, and so on. It's surprisingly rigid, so to speak. And I hadn't really expected that. I thought, and so maybe that's in that particular case, it's a counterexample to my, how hard is it to build the links type thing. In that particular case, with the level of crispness that we have in the design of functions in the language, it does become fairly easy to specify the links. But I think if you asked me, let's say I have a file about this, and it's some fairly fuzzy area, what see alsos should I give for that file? It's a much more challenging thing, because it really depends on how I'm thinking about that. What is connected to it. Tab is commenting, I think this knowledge graph thesis is to give people epistemological tools and make it visual, but epistemology isn't something people worry about all the time while writing daily notes. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's the late stage crystallization of what's going on, is what is the big picture of this field of knowledge. I mean, in a sense, that's, when I'm talking about language design, that in a sense is late stage crystallization. You have to understand the basic ideas, then you drill down and find the sort of optimal language primitives. But I think in the I'm just forming these things that, for me, it's like I have these areas I'm going to work on, and that's about the level of coarseness that I can deal with. And if you say to me, well, exactly how is your work on molecular computing going to be related to work on molecular biology and work on multi-computation and this, that, and the other thing, I don't know yet. And you say, is the molecular computing more related to multi-computation, or is it more related to some project about distributed computing? Well, that's related to multi-computation. Or let's say more related to a project about chemistry. I don't really know. That's it depends on how it works out. Aaron is asking, have I driven a Tesla in full self-driving mode? Yes, I have. I have to say, I am, for various reasons, but I'm not going to describe here, the well, it's a funny story, but I think not for the public record at this moment. But I thought I better find out what Teslas are like in full self-driving mode. So I did rent one for a few weeks, and I have to say I picked it up in Chicago, and I was like, oh, this is terrible. It's going to crash me into something, because it was a really complicated piece of driving, around a city, so to speak. And then I was taking it out towards where our company headquarters are in Champaign, Illinois, and down a freeway and into these much less populated streets. And it was pretty good until the moment when it almost drove me off the road, several times actually, because of kind of weird road conditions, which it wasn't hadn't seen before. I think it's when you run into people who work on self-driving cars, one of the things that's always interesting to hear about is what are the most bizarre things that quality assurance has seen in kind of the world of self-driving cars. I think one that I think I can mention is somebody told me about a situation where they had information from the self-driving car, and it got into the situation where it was driving down the street, and there was some ducks in the middle of the road, and there was a person in a motorized wheelchair who was circling the ducks in the middle of the road to prevent traffic from hitting the ducks. And of course, that's not a thing. It's like what's going on here? That's just not a thing one's seen before, and that's a weird corner case. So it's I do think that there are a number of kind of UX features of sort of the self-driving things of showing one the kind of what the vision system actually picked up, which for those of us who've been playing around with neural nets for years, it's kind of fun to see that really in action, showing all the different things and the different identifications it makes. Although I'm not sure that one is better off looking at that or looking out the windshield to see what thing one's going to run into next. I think maybe the second thing is the better idea. Philip comments, do you enjoy collecting and organizing physical books? Yes, I like physical books. I have about maybe 10,000 now. And I have, it's sort of an interesting thing because I've got a big library. Maybe sometime I'll do a tour of that on one of these live streams. It might be fun. I've got a lot of interesting books. And I have, that's a question of filing things. Again, I've got these sections, and I think I've got 60 sections in my library of different categories. And I write, in pencil on the back of the book, I write the section it's supposed to go in, because I was, because I reshelve the books, or sometimes somebody else reshelves them for me, but in their section, and by alphabetical order of author. I had this idea years ago. Okay, this is a story to tell against myself, so to speak. I had this idea. My wife retells this story to me every so often when she thinks I'm doing particularly crazy kind of organizational things. But I had this idea that I would really like to have the books organized by publication date, because it makes for much more interesting browsing than just by author name. And the problem with organizing by publication date is you don't see that on the outside of the book. So if you're reshelving a book, it's non-trivial to know where to put it. If you're trying to reshelve a book based on author name, or the author name is on the spine of the book, just look for the neighboring books and you figure out where to put it. Okay, so that was so the plan was, okay, and this was in, when was this? This was late 1990s. So the idea was to get somebody's saying yes to the library tour. Okay, I'll have to do that sometime. I just need to organize it and get somebody other than me to carry the camera type thing. Otherwise, I don't get to put books down and tell you all about them. But anyway, I think to finish this particular story. So I had this idea. I would, and this is a little bit one of these stories of personal organization goes wild. I had the idea that I would get these books sorted by publication date. That's often not completely trivial to tell from a book, because it might be a reprint of the 1920 book, but it was published in 1990. Should you put it in the 1920 place or the 1990 place, and so on? Okay, you can get a definition of that. But then there's a question: how do you reshelve the book? Okay, so I had this idea that one would basically have a computer-generated picture of the shelf, which involved the height of each book and the color of the spine of the book. Now, remember, this was ancient times, so at that time, this is probably 1998, 1999, I got a colorimeter, color measuring device, because at that time it wasn't, phone cameras and that whole story. And so I had this colorimeter. We measured a bunch of book spine colors. We measured the height of the spine. We knew I think we had from the Library of Congress data, from the standard book database, we had, or maybe the Bowker database, ISBN database, we had the information on the thickness of the spine and the height of the book and so on. And so then the idea was put it in a whole, Wolfram language database and be able to generate these pictures of what the shelf would look like, so that you could go look at the picture of the shelf, and then you've got this book in your hand. Oh, yes, I know where this book goes. It goes between that big yellow book and that small blue book. Okay, so this was too much effort was put into this, far too much. It should have been a killed project much more quickly. And then the really classic horror was that we were moving from to this house we've made, it involved moving, 7,000 books or something, and it was all carefully set up. Oh, we're going to arrange the books, etc. And then, the actual moving process was like, wait a minute, these boxes are half empty. Somebody said, let's just put more books in these boxes. And so the books arrive at the other end, and they're completely scrambled. And so you have 7,000 completely scrambled books, and none of this kind of crazy, we got colorimetry for every book, really helped anything. And there were just these giant piles of books, and it took a week actually to sort those out. But one of the challenges I have right now is I have, bookshelves, and I tend to put my own books in as filler books. I have some section, it's not completely full. So, okay, I'll throw some NKS books or some old Mathematica books or something in there as fillers to kind of keep the books upright, so to speak, but not, but know that I have extra space where I can pull those books out and put more sort of genuine books for that section in. But the problem is, over the course of years, I mean, the kind of library setup that I have right now is the main part of it has been 20 years that the books have been there, and I know where to find all kinds of books. Oh yeah, I know where the mathematical logic section is. I know whether this section is. I know where that section is. I can immediately find these sections, and and there's sections that are high up because I didn't care about that section, and I have to go climb on a library ladder to get to that section, and so on. But unfortunately, what's happened is, not too surprisingly, some sections there have really needed to expand over the years, and I really I did one kind of small seismic shift, and I really need to do some much bigger seismic shifts. And it's it's both a big pain in the neck to do it, because you've got to take all these books off the shelves, you've got to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But also, I personally know my library pretty well. And so it's kind of like, well, I want to find this kind of biography book. Oh, I know where it is. And as soon as I do the seismic shift, I'm going to lose all of that information. So that's and there are other issues as well. Like, for example, here's an issue about library organization. So I have a bunch of old books, antiquarian books, from anything from the 1600s on to the 1920s, 1930s, whatever. And then I have basically modern books. Although I started, they're books that I got from the 1970s, even a few from the 1960s, that are books that were sort of current books in the time when I got them, but which are now, old books, so to speak. So one of the challenges is, do I mix the book from the 1600s with the books from the 1990s? Probably not. do I mix the book from the 1890s with the book from the 1960s? Well, it's not so clear. And so, that's been one of the things that has been difficult to organize properly. Plus, another thing is that I have a database. In fact, it's even online, I think. I know there's a version of it online from a while ago, of books in my library. It's an example in our Wolfram data repository, among other things. It's kind of nice to have. If I want to look up a book in my library, it's sort of bad that I have to do this, but it's also sort of good that it's possible. It's right there in our data repository. There's a resource data object that is the books in my library, so I can go look things up from that. But in any case, the thing that I've been wanting to do that for some of the old books that I have, but they're much more difficult to deal with because they don't have ISBN numbers. Nobody invented ISBN numbers in 1750 or something, and they don't have copyright dates. They have, they'll have some maybe elaborately drawn, title page, but it's more difficult to kind of classify these things, and I just haven't gotten around to it yet. So, well, I think I have to go here, and actually, I get to do another live stream as part of my day job here. But I see a lot of interesting questions that I didn't get to today. So I hope you all can come back another time, and I'll be able to get to more questions. And thank you for asking interesting questions that get me to think about things. This is you ask me how I figure stuff out. As I say, this is part of that process for me, and part of the process of explaining sort of what my principles are for. I like to understand what my kind of personal principles are, and being asked about them is a great way to clarify what they really are. So thanks for that, and look forward to talking to you all another time. Okay, bye for now.